Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. It's here. Today, the House of Representatives held its first public televised hearing into the impeachment of President Donald J. Trump. It is just the fourth time in American history that we have done this kind of thing as a country. So if you're under the age of 20, you were not alive the last time this happened. Today, the American people got a fuller picture of the corrupt abuse of power by the President of the United States. We have known for over a month about the catalyst for this investigation when the Ukrainian president told President Trump he wanted to buy more American weapons, and the president responded, quote, "I would like you to do us a favor, though." So we have the call notes. We've gotten thousands and thousands of pages of transcripts from impeachment depositions of people testifying behind closed doors about what happened. But today, we got to hear it and see it with our own eyes. It was truly historic. The first witnesses in the impeachment hearing, Acting U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine William Taylor and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State George Kent. They testified in front of the House Intelligence Committee for more than 5 hours. And what we heard was specific testimony about how President Trump withheld military assistance from Ukraine, a country currently occupied by Russia, a country in desperate need of that aid and assistance, in order to squeeze the new Ukrainian president into manufacturing dirt on the president's political rival. Ambassador Taylor, a man who served in critical State Department roles around the world for over 3 decades and who, somewhat remarkably, still wakes up every morning when he's back in Ukraine and goes to work at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, described a conversation with the U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, when Taylor realized that President Trump was, in fact, withholding this vital military aid for his own personal gain.
I sent Ambassador Sondland a text message asking if we are now saying that the security assistance and a White House meeting are conditioned on investigations. Ambassador Sondland responded, asking me to call him, which I did. During that phone call, Ambassador Sondland told me that President Trump had told him that he wants President Zelensky to state publicly that Ukraine will investigate Burisma and alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. Ambassador Sondland also told me that he now recognized that he had made a mistake by earlier telling Ukrainian officials that only a White House meeting with President Zelensky was dependent on a public announcement of the investigations. In fact, Ambassador Sondland said, everything was dependent on such an announcement, including security assistance.
Ambassador Taylor also explained how he learned that the words investigate corruption were just code for investigate the Democrats and the Bidens.
I had come to understand well before then that investigations was a term Ambassadors Volker and Sondland used to mean matters related to the 2016 elections and to investigations of Burisma and the Bidens.
Taylor also made a huge bit of news today when he revealed a previously undisclosed recent communication with a member of his staff that clearly demonstrates President Trump's priorities and motivations. Keep in mind that the interaction Taylor is describing in the bit of sound I'm going to play for you is from literally the day after Trump's infamous phone call with the Ukrainian president.
Last Friday, a member of my staff told me of events that occurred on July 26th. While Ambassador Volker and I visited the front, this member of my staff accompanied Ambassador Sondland. Ambassador Sondland met with Mr. Yermak. Following that meeting, in the presence of my staff at a restaurant, Ambassador Sondland called President Trump and told him of his meetings in Kyiv. The member of my staff could hear President Trump on the phone asking Ambassador Sondland about the investigations. Ambassador Sondland told President Trump the Ukrainians were ready to move forward. Following the call with President Trump, the member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland responded that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden, which Giuliani was pressing for.
I mean, there you have it, I guess, right? President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden. He sure does. That is what this whole thing is about. Gordon Sondland, a man who donated $1 million to the Trump inaugural committee and basically got the ambassador gig as a thank you, meets with his top Ukrainian official the day after the president's infamous call. After that meeting, Sondland goes to a restaurant. In the middle of the restaurant, decides to just ring up the prez to update him. And the president asks Sondland about the investigations. And he is doing it so loudly that other people near Sondland can hear President Trump. And Ambassador Sondland tells him the deal is on. We've closed it. You talked to him yesterday. I'm here in person to close. The Ukrainians are ready to move forward with the investigations. Two sources tell NBC News that the man who relayed that account to Ambassador Taylor, a man named David Holmes, will now be giving a private deposition to the committee on Friday. Trump was asked about that conversation at a press conference this afternoon and completely punted, saying, "I don't recall, no, not at all, not even a little bit." Today's hearing was the first opportunity for congressional Republicans to publicly cross-examine people who had front-row seats to the president's extortion of Ukraine. It was their chance to refute the accusations being made, to build a strong defense of the president's actions. They did not really do any of those things. Instead, they tried to make the hearing all about Joe Biden's son, argued that what those political investigations were in the best interest of Ukraine and the U.S., but Deputy Assistant Secretary of State George Kent shredded that defense.
Is pressuring Ukraine to conduct what I believe you've called political investigations a part of U.S. foreign policy to promote the rule of law in Ukraine and around the world?
It is not.
Is it in the national interest of the United States?
In my opinion, it is not.
So in other words, it is a purpose of our foreign policy to encourage foreign nations to refrain from conducting political investigations. Is that right?
Correct. And in fact, as a matter of policy, not of programming, we oftentimes raise our concerns, usually in private, with countries that we feel are engaged in selective political prosecution and persecution of their opponents.
It's George Kent, who previously served as the senior anti-corruption coordinator in the State Department's European Bureau, saying President Trump's pressure campaign was itself a kind of corruption, that it was bad for the U.S. and bad for Ukraine, which I think just about sums up the entire story that we heard today. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.